How to make money when plague breaks out during the Middle Ages. Picture this. The year is 1348. The Black Death has just arrived in your town. People are fleeing, churches are overflowing, and the local lord has locked himself in his castle. Most people see only despair. But if you're clever, if you're willing to take risks that others won't, this is your moment. Because throughout history, every great plague has created enormous opportunities for those bold enough to seize them. Let's start with the most obvious one. Grave digging. When plague hits a medieval town, bodies pile up fast, the church can't keep up. Local authorities are desperate for anyone willing to handle the dead. Grave diggers during the Black Death could charge enormous fees, sometimes 10 times the normal rate. Yes, it's grim work, but the pay was extraordinary. And here's the thing most people don't realize. Gravediggers who survived the plague often became some of the wealthiest commoners in their villages. Next up, medicine. Now, I know what you're thinking. Medieval medicine was terrible. And you're right, but that didn't stop people from paying for it. Plague doctors, apothecaries, and herbalists could name their price during an outbreak. Vinegar, rosemary, camphor, and theriac were all sold as plague remedies. Did they work? Mostly no, but demand was insatiable. If you had any knowledge of herbs or could mix a convincing tincture, you could make a fortune. Some apothecaries raised their prices by 500% during plague years. And people still paid. Now let's talk about real estate. This is where the truly massive wealth was made. When a third of the population dies, land becomes incredibly cheap. Entire farms were abandoned. Manor houses sat empty. If you had even a small amount of savings, you could buy property for a fraction of its former value. And when the plague eventually passed, and it always did, that land was worth 10 or 20 times what you paid. The smartest merchants and minor nobles of the 14th century built their family fortunes by buying land during plague years. Labor is another huge opportunity. Before the plague, peasants had almost no bargaining power. Lords could pay whatever they wanted. But after the Black Death killed a third of the workforce, suddenly every surviving laborer was incredibly valuable. Wages doubled, sometimes tripled. Skilled workers like blacksmiths, carpenters, and masons could demand premium rates. Some workers traveled from town to town, offering their services to the highest bidder. This was so disruptive that the English Parliament actually passed the Statute of Labourers in 1351, trying to freeze wages at pre-plague levels. It didn't work. The market always wins. Trade routes offer another path to profit. When plague strikes one region, goods from that area become scarce everywhere else. Spices, textiles, grain, and salt all spike in price. If you could move goods from unaffected areas into plague zones, the margins were enormous. Yes, it was dangerous. Many merchants died on these journeys. But those who survived became fabulously wealthy. The great merchant families of Venice, Genoa, and Florence all expanded their empires during plague years by controlling trade routes others were too afraid to use. Let's not forget about religion. The church was the wealthiest institution in medieval Europe, and plague made people incredibly generous. Donations to churches, monasteries, and religious orders skyrocketed during outbreaks. People wrote enormous bequests into their wills, hoping to buy their way into heaven. If you were a member of the clergy, or could establish a new religious order promising prayers for the dead, the donations would flow like water. Finally, there's the simplest strategy of all: survival. Just staying alive during a major plague outbreak was itself a form of wealth creation. If you survived and your competitors didn't, you inherited their customers, their market share, their reputation. Many of the great guild families of the late medieval period rose to prominence simply because they outlasted their rivals. So there you have it. 7 ways to build wealth during a medieval plague. Grave digging, medicine, real estate, labor, trade, religion, and simple survival. The Black Death was one of the worst catastrophes in human history. But it was also one of the greatest wealth transfers. The feudal system that had dominated Europe for centuries began to crumble, and a new class of wealthy commoners emerged from the ashes. History teaches us that even in the darkest times, opportunity exists for those willing to look for it.